M. Kwong Thien. The negotiators are truly excellent, wonderful people. They like me, and I like them too. The only thing is, they charge us up to 90%, while we only charge them 46%. Statement caused Vietnam. One of the concepts predicted to become the most prominent trend in the global economy by 2025 is rent-seeking. President Donald Trump once declared that money is the most beautiful word in the dictionary, even more beautiful than love, like a sweet lullaby soothing his soul. Meanwhile, most economists agree that corruption undermines economic efficiency and causes unnecessary losses. For hundreds of years, from economists and politicians to ordinary citizens, attitudes toward tariffs have been sharply divided into two opposing camps, with endless debate. A concept that seems so simple, yet when placed within the complex macroeconomic landscape, can create unpredictable ripple effects. So, in the competition among nations, what role do mercenaries truly play? Why is the strategy of using mercenaries considered optimal? And ultimately, do mercenaries bring benefits or harm to a nation? By broadening our perspective and tracing back through history to analyze the evolution of global trade over the past 300 years, each of us may draw our own conclusions. This video will help you master all the knowledge about tariffs. Let's get started right away. First, let's explore the concept of rent-seeking through a simple illustrative example. Suppose there is a country named Grilled Pork and Milk, located right next to another nation that specializes in producing powdered milk with a dominant advantage, called Milk Cow. The sausage cheese nation must import a large amount of cow's milk from dairy farms. Typically, a carton of powdered milk sells for 100 dong. But one day, the Cha Sua government suddenly imposed a 20% import tax on powdered milk. From that point onward, for every carton of powdered milk imported from the dairy cows, businesses were forced to pay 20 currency units in tax to the Cha Sua authorities. To preserve profits, importers are forced to raise retail prices by 120 dong per carton for customers. This is essentially how tariffs work at the most basic level. From Cha Sua's perspective, tariffs have both clear advantages and limitations. On the upside, the government earns an additional 20 dong per barrel, which is a significant supplementary source of income. However, consumers have to spend more money to buy the same product, which reduces their satisfaction. This is the drawback. At the same time, domestic milk powder producers in Cha Sua also benefited. The rising prices of imported milk helped them enhance their competitiveness, thereby attracting more local customers. This helps boost revenue, expand production scale, attract more investment capital, and create more job opportunities. These are all significant benefits. This is the most basic form of the tariff mechanism with the direct impacts it brings. A prime example is in 2018, when Donald Trump imposed tariffs ranging from 20% to 50% on imported washing machines. Over the next 3 years, the US government earned approximately $1 billion from this policy. At the same time, washing machine prices rose by about 34% the following year. While other household appliances increased by only about 23%, washing machines grew faster than the industry average, reaching approximately 33%. What's noteworthy is that not only washing machines imported from Korea or China have seen price hikes, but even those manufactured in the US have also raised their prices across the board. Even the price of dryers has gone up. And of course, American consumers are the ones who have to bear this price increase. Corporations like Samsung and LG have expanded production at their US factories in response to tariff policies. American businesses, including OnePro, are also ramping up production expansion. Estimates indicate that the total number of new jobs created amounts to approximately 2,000. Looking back, the developments that occurred largely aligned with the initial theoretical analysis. In this scenario, the government and producers were the beneficiaries, while consumers ended up bearing the losses. This is just a small example, but it clearly shows the direct consequences of buying and selling official positions. One side benefits, while the other suffers. From this, it is clear that the essence of renting officials is essentially a trade-off between consumption and employment. When an industry faces excessively high import tariffs, the consequence is that consumers bear the losses to compensate for the benefits of domestic producers and the state budget. One side gains, the other loses. Therefore, the core issue at hand is, on a national scale, does hiring officials ultimately lead to better development for the country or only worsen the situation? This is one of the challenges that any government must face. The decision on whether to impose tariffs on foreign countries is a crucial issue. To fully understand this, first, I believe we need to have a basic understanding of a classic economic model. Going back to the example of the country that pays for milk before tariffs. Total surplus, also known as total social benefit, is represented by a specific area on the graph. However, when the tax was applied, that area shrank, losing two ragged portions of its shape. This damage represents a loss in the overall happiness of society as a whole and is referred to as deadweight loss. In summary, this model shows that imposing taxes harms consumers, while benefiting the government and producers. But overall, society as a whole will operate less efficiently, leading to unnecessary losses. Therefore, free trade is considered to deliver the most optimal efficiency. Measures such as tariffs, quotas, or other trade barriers are all considered ineffective and reduce overall social welfare. If we strictly adhere to this theoretical model, it appears that hiring officials always causes harm, and the government should never implement such a measure. But reality is not that simple or ideal. Beyond the theoretical model, the actual practice of hiring officials brings with it numerous unforeseen consequences that initial calculations could not anticipate. First and foremost, hiring mandarins can help protect and promote the development of domestic industries. Alexander Hamilton, the first U.S. Secretary of the Treasury in the 18th century, was the very first to propose this theory. He called it the infant industry protection theory. The idea is that many industries in their early stages need protection to grow. Currently, they are not yet capable of competing with foreign rivals. At this point, accepting a short-term sacrifice of some consumer benefits in exchange for the sustainable development of the domestic manufacturing industry may be a worthwhile trade-off. For example, in the 19th century, the US and Germany implemented protective measures for their textile, steel, and automotive industries. And thanks to the unintended support from British colonial policies, the manufacturing industries of the US and Germany grew significantly stronger. Another example is about 30 years ago, when mainland China imposed an import tax on cars as high as over 200%. They also actively attract foreign investment. Thanks to the combination of investment attraction policies and the development of the automotive industry, the Chinese market has steadily matured. Currently, among the major world powers, do you know which country has the highest average tax rate? The answer is India. Make in India. Despite repeated opposition and restrictions from the World Trade Organization, WTO, India is striving to impose the highest possible tariffs to protect its domestic industry. This action prompted many other countries to successively file complaints against India with the World Trade Organization, WTO. Not only India, but in reality, the majority of developing countries impose significantly higher import tariffs compared to developed nations. The primary purpose is to protect key industries. However, imposing taxes doesn't simply increase costs for consumers. If the imported goods are not direct consumer products but raw materials for the production process, tariffs also drive up production costs for the entire downstream supply chain. This could harm the entire related industry. Going back to the milk tea example, imposing import taxes on powdered milk will drive up its price, thereby negatively impacting the entire domestic bubble tea production industry. Similarly, over the years, the US has consistently sought to protect its steel industry by imposing high import tariffs. In 2018, President Trump decided to impose a 25% tariff on steel and a 10% tariff on imported aluminum. This provides the domestic steel industry with more opportunities for recovery, but at the same time, it also drives steel prices up sharply. The severe impact on industries reliant on steel, such as automobile and machinery manufacturing. Major corporations like General Motors, Ford, and Caterpillar have all suffered negative impacts. The CEO of Ford openly admitted that steel import tariffs cost the company at least $1 billion. Therefore, the eminent economist John Maynard Keynes proposed a practical solution. If taxation is unavoidable, it should only be applied to the final product. Avoid taxing raw materials to protect the remaining stages in the domestic production chain. This next move on tariffs is a positive step that usually receives significant public support. Most people tend to default to the assumption that importing goods is no different than allowing money to flow abroad is like a bleeding wound, making them feel insecure. To protect domestic production, the government has decided to increase import taxes. Often supported by many people in society, the main impact of tariff increases is also a matter worth serious consideration. An interesting phenomenon that warrants deeper study is the role of oscillating states. These are swing states with unpredictable election outcomes, which can lean toward either party in U.S. presidential elections. These states are home to several key industries, and the labor unions in these sectors wield significant influence over local election outcomes. Therefore, unions in these swing states also have an indirect but significant influence on federal government policies. Therefore, from a self-interested perspective, it's evident that many U.S. tariff policies are essentially designed to protect the interests of key industries in swing states. A prime example is during his first 500-day term, when a notable trade policy was implemented, raising import tariffs on steel and aluminum. What a coincidence! Pennsylvania, home to the famous steel city of Pittsburgh, is also one of the most crucial battlegrounds in recent elections. It should be noted that the U.S. Steelworkers Union is extremely large in scale, with over 1.2 million members and its headquarters located in Pennsylvania. Just a few years ago, when Japan's Newton Steel Group was preparing to acquire U.S. Steel, a major American steel company, the steel industry unions immediately voiced strong opposition and launched lobbying efforts. Amid national security concerns, on January 3 of this year, President Joe Biden signed an executive order to block this season's sale deal. Not only Trump, but even former U.S. presidents like George Bush, Jimmy Carter, or Ronald Reagan have implemented similar protectionist policies in the past. Of course, it cannot be asserted that all these policy decisions stem from union pressure. But it is clear that the industries in the state of Guangdong play a crucial role in shaping America's trade policies and influence. Rub salt in the wound. In 2018, when Trump imposed import tariffs on steel and aluminum, Canada immediately retaliated by announcing plans to levy counter-tariffs on $12.5 billion worth of U.S. goods. However, initially Canada did not specify which products would be subject to tariffs. They only announced that they would review and announce the details later. A few days later, the sanctions list was announced, surprising many as it included a series of items seemingly unrelated to steel or aluminum, such as ketchup, orange juice, toilet paper, or mayonnaise. But if you look closely, behind that list lies an extremely subtle political strategy. Hayes, the renowned ketchup brand headquartered in Pennsylvania, primarily produces its orange juice in Florida, another strategically important state. Toilet paper and mayonnaise are primarily produced in Wisconsin, a key swing state in U.S. elections. Clearly, Canada has targeted key products from politically influential U.S. states to impose retaliatory tariffs, aiming to directly hit sensitive pressure points in America's political landscape. And just as predicted, this strategy proved effective. Just 1 year later, the U.S. was forced to return to the negotiating table with Canada and ultimately agreed to lift tariffs on steel imports from the country. The two sides quickly reached a new North American trade agreement. The USMCA, also known as the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, is the direct result of the reciprocal tariff battles we previously discussed. You see, we've discussed extensively the impact of tariffs on the country implementing this policy, including both the positive aspects and the limitations. However, when considered in the global context, for the taxed nation or competitor in the field of commerce, the impact is almost certain to be negative. In other words, it's uncertain whether tariffs actually benefit the country that imposes them. And this very disadvantage can be turned into a significant advantage, as tariffs are also an extremely important negotiation tool. If a country firmly refuses to concede and rejects the proposed conditions, at that point, the country could impose import tariffs as a pressure tactic, forcing the opposing party to return to the negotiating table. If you refuse to listen, I will target your export industry. Trump was extremely fond of this tactic, though it was unclear whether he was an economic genius or not. However, from a negotiation standpoint, this can be seen as a tactic of inflating the price. Do you remember when he withdrew from the World Information Technology Organization, abbreviated as CO? The purpose is likely not to withdraw troops, but to apply pressure to renegotiate another agreement. In 2017, Trump announced the U.S. withdrawal from NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and imposed tariffs on goods imported from Canada. This action forced Canada to respond and implement retaliatory measures. As analyzed in the previous section, However, afterward, both sides returned to the negotiating table and ultimately reached an agreement on the new USMCA deal. This agreement offers more advantages to the US side, particularly in two key areas: automobile manufacturing and agricultural exports. Recently, Trump once again drew attention by threatening to impose a 25% tariff on imported goods from Canada and Mexico. I don't know if he really intends to do that or is just pretending to put on pressure. But clearly, this is an extremely decisive and highly effective negotiation tactic. However, when a country uses tariffs as a means to exert pressure, of course, the other side will also react. That's unavoidable. And the cost of these counterattacks is often extremely high and difficult to predict. A prime example is the 1963 chicken war that erupted between the US and West Germany. At that time, the US exported large quantities of chicken to Europe, which greatly angered poultry farmers in West Germany. The result is that the European Union imposed a 40% tariff on chicken imported from the US. The US chicken export volume to Europe plummeted from $50 million to just $20 million within a year. The US immediately retaliated by imposing a 25% tariff on imported light trucks from Europe. This has caused heavy losses for automakers like Volkswagen. Finally, both sides suffered losses. Truck prices in the US are soaring, while chicken prices in Europe are also rising sharply across the board. Consumers on both sides will ultimately be the ones to bear the consequences. The benefits only go to chicken farms in Europe and American truck manufacturers. Another benefit of tariffs that Trump often mentions is their potential to help reduce trade deficits. Theoretically, this is entirely correct. When import tariffs increase, the volume of imported goods will decrease, thereby reducing the trade deficit. However, most current tariff policies primarily focus on specific goods with a limited scope of application, like washing machines, formula milk, or steel. And the total value of these goods is often too low to significantly impact the overall trade balance. If a broad-based tax is implemented as Trump once mentioned, meaning taxing everyone and all goods, when prices rise, it's not just the cost of a few individual items that is affected. This could impact the entire domestic price level and alter the structure of the industry, and triggered widespread retaliatory actions from multiple countries. Another important factor we haven't mentioned yet is the exchange rate. Factors like currency fluctuations can completely shift the landscape. This makes the anticipated effects of tariffs unpredictable in the long term. Finally, have you ever wondered why the US consistently maintains such a large and prolonged trade deficit? Is it because America is too prosperous, because of cheap foreign goods, or simply because Americans overspend? Actually, this issue is far more complicated than we think. Perhaps we should discuss this another time, when we can delve deeper into the nature of global trade and international financial flows. Essentially, tariffs conceal many hidden costs that we often fail to recognize. For example, this reduces the diversity of domestic goods, limits cultural exchange with the world, and weakens competitiveness. Meanwhile, these are the very core benefits that free trade delivers. If we revisit the analysis of the pros and cons of tariffs up to now, when combining the practical elements, the bigger picture becomes clearer. Currently, economists have reached a relatively broad consensus on the matter that if a country imposes tariffs indiscriminately, without considering the specific target or timing, this will almost certainly harm the economy. However, if tariffs are applied correctly, at the right time, and for a limited period to protect infant industries, creating more jobs not only addresses immediate issues but also brings long-term benefits. Therefore, tariffs cannot be simply judged as either good or bad. It's a double-edged sword. Therefore, when Trump announced tariffs on goods imported from Canada and Mexico, and all the other countries even tax penguins, many economists have opposed this. One of them is Paul Krugman, the renowned Nobel Prize-winning economist. For their significant contributions to the field of international trade theory, he argued that this kind of indiscriminate and blanket taxation is unreasonable. It will cause serious damage to the US economy. Here are the natural English translations for the given Vietnamese text. I only approach the issue from an economic perspective. Regarding President Trump, perhaps he has his own political calculations or strategies that I'm not aware of. Therefore, it's hard for me to make an accurate comment. The above analyses of the pros and cons provide us with a basis to clearly understand who benefits. Who will bear the brunt when a new tax policy is enacted? From here, we can expand the issue with a more fundamental question. The answer lies in game theory. Specifically, this is a classic example of the prisoner's dilemma. In reality, international trade relations are quite similar to this situation. Let's build a simple model with two countries, country A and country B. Every country has two choices: opening up trade or implementing protectionist measures, such as imposing tariffs or import restrictions, are two distinct policy choices. From this, we can outline four scenarios as follows. The first point is that both countries have opened up to integration, and each has reaped mutual benefits threefold. Second, both sides implemented protective measures, but in the end, each country suffered losses. And the third point is that when opens the door, B will step in to protect and benefit greatly with a bonus of 8, while A suffers a loss, with their energy reduced to only 5. Finally, when B opens the door, B will be protected and greatly benefit, plus 8 points, while A suffers heavy losses, only 5 points remain. And finally, B opens the door, A protects, A gains 8 points while B loses 5. If both sides open their doors, clearly both will benefit more than if they close them for protection together. But in each specific case, which country will shift from an open-door policy to trade protectionism? No matter how others act, each person can still secure their own benefit. If country A is opening up and notices that country B is doing the same, A may consider. If we switch to protection mode, we will move from gate 3 to gate 8. If B is already protected, A would think it best for us to also seek protection to reduce from 5 words down to 3. The result is that in all cases, A finds choosing protection to be the most optimal option. And likewise, B also reached the same conclusion. Finally, both chose protectionism, resulting in a lose-lose outcome where neither side gained anything. And ironically, they fell right into the classic prisoner's dilemma, collectively choosing the worst option while believing it to be the wisest decision. In this model, that phenomenon is referred to as a tariff deadlock. Is there any way to get out of this deadlock? The answer is yes. One of the most common methods is to apply a strategy and play the game over and over again. International trade is not just about individual transactions, but also about sustainable, long-term relationships between nations. In a repeated game, a country may initially choose the strategy of opening its market, while simultaneously warning that if the opponent dares to impose tariffs, they will respond in kind. They will counterattack immediately. This forces the opponent to think carefully, because they know any retaliation will come swiftly. If both sides are fully aware of this, the optimal long-term solution is open cooperation to maintain stable benefits and prevent the risk of escalating tensions. Tit for tat, history has proven the costly lesson of failing to employ a proportional response strategy, notably during the 18th and 19th centuries. The empire on which the sun never sets. Believing in the power of free trade, they argued that they could inspire other nations by taking the lead in opening their markets and reducing tariffs first. As a global superpower, I believe I must live nobly, maintain a dignified demeanor, and have a far-sighted vision. Here are the natural English translations. Other countries still maintain protectionist policies, putting you at a significant disadvantage in various industries. That was a memorable lesson in underestimating the strategic element in a battle of wits. Thus, like the joke of a little-known character, Tiu Lam. Free trade is a good thing, but one-sided openness and not responding when punished is an unwise move. At first glance, it may sound extreme, but in reality, it holds a thought-provoking strategic lesson. Tit for tat. Moreover, this method also proves effective in various other complex systems, such as nature, society, or work environments. The important thing is not to silently endure or retaliate when insulted. In other words, show people that you're not someone who can be easily threatened or bullied. The second strategy to escape this tax deadlock is, beyond mutual exchanges, we should focus on building a mutually beneficial community. Countries can jointly establish organizations like VFTO or form close alliances such as the European Union, EU. Or signing long-term agreements such as NAFTA, which was later replaced by USMCA. VFTO currently has 166 member countries, accounting for over 98% of global trade volume. This organization was established to optimize mutual benefits and prevent getting trapped in tariff barriers. VFTO also has a strict penalty mechanism for any country that violates the rules. However, some countries still do not comply. At this point, VFTO reverted to its initial strategy, allowing affected nations the right to retaliate proportionally. A prime example is the 20-year-long dispute between the US and the European Union, EU, over subsidy issues. For aircraft manufacturers Airbus and Boeing, in 2024, the US filed a complaint against the EU with the World Trade Organization, WTO, accusing the bloc of unfairly subsidizing Airbus. The EU objected by pointing out that the US was also subsidizing Boeing. VFTO assessed that both sides were at fault and called for an end to the subsidies. But neither side was willing to listen, and in the end, VFTO was forced to allow retaliatory action. In 2019, the US had the right to impose retaliatory tariffs on goods from the EU, with a total value of up to $7.5 billion annually. In 2020, the EU was permitted to impose countermeasures corresponding to a value of up to $4 billion annually. By 2021, the two sides finally resumed negotiations and reached an agreement to temporarily suspend the trade war for 5 years while continuing discussions. Another notable dispute between the US and Canada involving lumber erupted in 1982 and persisted for decades afterward. The US accuses Canada of violating timber industry subsidy rules, while Canada denies the allegations and files a complaint with the World Trade Organization, WTO. After years of tension, the two sides finally reached an agreement. The US reduces tariffs, while Canada agrees to comply with certain trade control provisions. Similarly, countless trade wars occur every year, marked by their intensity and complexity. Tit for tat has played an extremely important role over the past century. Dung remains steadfast in maintaining stability and expanding international trade, while actively promoting the trend of tariff reduction. Now, we have a clearer understanding of the nature of this worldview and its advantages, drawbacks, and practical negotiation tactics. For a more comprehensive perspective, let's review the development journey of global trade over the past 3 centuries. Before the 19th century, the concept of true free trade globalization had never emerged. Most commercial activities took place within the British Empire's colonial system. This passage leans more toward contemplation and exploitation rather than a spirit of cooperation. England once implemented a very strong trade protection policy, particularly for the woolen industry. Manufactured goods account for up to 50% of the average import volume, the highest in Europe currently. Until a figure of extraordinary influence in economic history emerges. David Ricardo was a prominent British economist of the classical school. The theory of comparative advantage, proposed by David Ricardo, laid the foundation for modern free trade ideology. He stated that each country should focus on producing goods in which they have a comparative advantage. After that, both parties can exchange goods through free trade. This method benefits all parties by optimizing resources and enhancing overall performance. This theory coincided with the rapidly advancing wave of technology at the time. England has been a pioneer in reducing tariffs and promoting free trade with many countries. The proportion of exported goods globally relative to total GDP has risen from approximately 5% to over 10%. This period is considered the first wave of globalization. However, in the tide of globalization, two nations have largely stood apart from the common trend, steadfastly pursuing a closed development model. The United States and Germany are the two countries mentioned. Especially the United States, which is still regarded as a model of free trade today. But in its early days of establishment, this country was renowned for its extremely strong protectionist trade policies. Before 1914, the US federal government's primary budget revenue relied almost entirely on tariffs and excise taxes. The first Minister of Finance, Alexander Hamilton, who was once noted for his protectionist theory on the hat-making industry. He did not believe in Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, or at the very least, he thought it was not suitable for the American context at that time. After 1860, while Britain and France uniformly reduced import tariffs to below 10%, the US went against this trend by raising tariffs. The import tax was raised by over 40%, making this country one of those with the highest import tariffs in the world. Over a span of more than 30 years, From 1867 to 1900, thanks to the implementation of protective policies, U.S. steel production increased by over 500 times. The manufacturing industry flourished, enabling the United States to surpass Britain and become the world's leading industrial power. Therefore, from Ricardo's perspective, England recognized the benefits that free trade brought. But it doesn't account for the scenario where only one country opens its doors while other major powers like the US or Germany maintain their protectionist policies. The cost may be unbearably high. That's precisely why that bitter remark came about. Unilaterally opening doors without retaliatory measures when punished is an unwise move. At the beginning of the 20th century, World War I and the subsequent Great Depression sparked a wave of trade protectionism. The rise of trade protectionism worldwide peaked in 1930 when the US passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. The government has decided to raise import taxes on over 20,000 items, with increases ranging from 20% to 60%. But this time, unlike the 19th century, Europe did not remain silent. They responded by imposing retaliatory tariffs. And the world entered a severe trade recession. US export volumes continued to decline, with the drop reaching as much as 2%. The global export to GDP ratio has returned to levels last seen a century ago. The first wave of globalization has officially ended. Economists all agree that this harsh protectionist phase prolonged the recession in the US while driving global unemployment to record highs. And it worsened the economic crisis. Yet, it was from that very failure that humanity learned a painful lesson, paving the way for the second wave of globalization. After World War II, the world, particularly the United States, suffered severe consequences from trade protectionist policies. Under the leadership of the United States, countries came together to negotiate, and by 1947, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, was established. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, abbreviated as GATT, was established and became the precursor to today's World Trade Organization, WTO. However, that does not mean nations will immediately open their hearts and trust one another. Building trust is a long-term journey. In 1949, countries held their first negotiations in France and reached an agreement to collectively reduce approximately 5,000 tariff lines. In 1951, a new round of negotiations took place in London, further reducing over 8,000 tariff lines. Trust continued to grow, and by the 1960s, many countries began to open up more. However, just as globalization was progressing smoothly, the chicken war between the US and West Germany, previously mentioned, erupted. Nevertheless, the process of globalization continued to advance relentlessly. According to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, of 1947, the average tariff rate at that time was approximately 22%. After several rounds of negotiations, this rate dropped to 15% in the 1960s and continued to decline sharply, reaching only about 5% by 2000. The share of exports in global GDP has steadily increased from 5% to 25% over 60 years. Alongside the robust growth of global GDP, the world entered a golden age of globalization. However, over the past 10 years, the world has witnessed major upheavals such as Brexit or the US tariff policies. The US-China trade war signals the return of protectionism once again. Particularly, after the COVID-19 pandemic, many countries, whether proactively or reactively, have had to change their management and response approaches. Nations are increasingly focusing on economic nationalism, promoting domestic production and protecting local industries. Looking at today's content as a whole, from the mechanism of tariff operations to the pros and cons of